Welcome, friends. Come on in and let the day loosen its hold for a while, whether you're curled beneath a blanket, resting your head against a familiar pillow, or sitting quietly while the last soft evening light fades from the room. I am glad you're here. Let the noise of the present drift a little farther away. Let the shoulders settle, the breathing slow, and the nighttime quiet gather around you without hurry. So, before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these journeys into the past. And let me know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. There is something comforting in imagining listeners scattered across different rooms, towns, and countries, each one pausing at the edge of sleep while the same old story begins. Tonight, we are stepping back into a world that was never truly silent. Medieval Europe was filled with sound from dawn until the final embers dimmed. Bells measured the hours. Carts groaned over rutted roads. Hens scratched near thresholds. Geese complained beside muddy ponds, and iron tools rang against wood and stone. In cottages, manor houses, abbeys, and castles, ordinary noises shaped the day. Silence, when it came suddenly, could feel less like peace and more like an absence needing explanation. To understand why quiet could seem dangerous, it helps to forget the modern idea that silence is restful. For many medieval people, safety had to sound neighbours talking beyond a wattle wall, sheep shifting inside a pen, a watchman calling the hour, or monks chanting behind a stone church door. Familiar noise meant that the village still watched, worked, prayed, and breathed. When those sounds vanished, the mind supplied reasons, and not all were gentle. Imagine a small village near a forest, perhaps in England, northern France, or the German lands. No one can quite agree on how such places sounded from hour to hour, because records rarely describe the obvious. Yet household rules, court testimony, and monastic observations suggest constant low activity. Rushes covered floors. Smoke crept through soot-dark rafters. Wooden spoons knocked against bowls of pottage. A hand mill rasped as grain was ground, and a cooper tightened hoops around a barrel. Even at night, a settlement did not become still all at once. Cattle breathed in byres joined to houses. Dogs stirred when strangers passed. Wind pressed against ill-fitting shutters. Damp roof hay settled with faint crackling sounds, while mice moved behind baskets and chests. A sleeping village made its own quiet music, and those within it knew the pattern well enough to notice change. A sudden hush among animals was troubling. A barking dog that stopped without reason, chickens that ceased clucking, or birds disappearing from a hedgerow could suggest a fox, a wolf, a thief, or an approaching rider. Some chroniclers claimed that animals sensed storms, sickness, or unseen spirits before humans did. Historians continue to debate how widely this belief was shared, but observation and superstition often stood side by side. A villager might fear a wolf and a wandering spirit at the same moment without contradiction. Beyond the last cottage, roads were dark and uneven, edged by ditches, thorn hedges, and roadside shrines. Travellers heard leather straps creak, hooves strike mud, and cloaks brush against saddles. Such sounds announced movement and companionship. If the road ahead became strangely quiet, a traveller might slow down. Robbers could be waiting among the trees, using silence almost as effectively as darkness. In market towns, noise offered another kind of protection. The smith's hammer, sellers' cries, clattering trenchers, and arguments over market tolls created a public world where actions were witnessed. A silent lane behind the stalls felt different from the square. Beside shuttered workshops and narrow drains, quiet might cover theft or violence. Medieval law often depended on neighbours hearing a cry for help, and some communities expected witnesses to raise the hue and cry. Sound could become a civic duty. To call out was to summon the community. To remain silent might seem suspicious. That suspicion entered the household. Oak doors were thick but rarely soundproof. Families slept close together, often in one room, wrapped in wool blankets on beds, benches, or straw-filled sacks. Privacy was limited, and quiet behaviour drew attention because little happened unseen. A servant moving without a candle, a guest who stopped speaking, or a chamber kept closed too long might awaken uneasy questions. Yet silence was not always feared. In churches, it could be sacred. Before dawn, A priest might stand beside beeswax candles while worshippers lowered their voices beneath stone arches. Monasteries observed silence, especially after Compline, the final service of the day. But sacred quiet had rules and purpose. Silence without order was different. It might suggest that the bell ringer was ill, the watch had failed, or the guardians of night were absent. Far across the fields, moonlight rested on frozen furrows and pale roofs. A bell sounded from a distant church tower, faint at first, then clearer as the wind shifted. Inside the village, someone turned on a straw mattress. A horse stamped in its stall. Rain began softly against wooden shutters. Each small noise restored the known world. Perhaps that was the heart of the matter. Medieval people did not merely hear sound, they read it. A creaking gate, the rhythm of footsteps, the number of bell strokes, and voices beyond a wall all carried meaning. Sound told them who was awake, whether the road was occupied, and whether the order of the hours continued. Silence could feel dangerous because it erased information. It hid movement, covered intentions, and interrupted familiar patterns. In an age before street lamps, telephones, household clocks, or organised police patrols, listening was part of remaining safe. And so the medieval night was never empty. It was watched through sound, measured by sound, and made bearable by sound. Beyond the houses, the forest waited in darkness. Above the village, the church tower stood against the sky. Between them, ordinary people rested lightly, comforted by noises they recognized and alert to silence they did not. Before sunrise, while roofs were still black against the sky and lanes remained silvered with frost, the first bell moved through the darkness. It did not merely announce an hour. It gathered the settlement into one shared moment. Farmers beneath wool blankets heard it through timber walls. Bakers heard it above the crackle of ovens. A widow in a narrow chamber crossed herself before rising, and a stable boy beside the horses counted the strokes without thinking. Across medieval Europe, bells gave shape to time long before ordinary households owned reliable clocks. Their voices came from parish churches, abbeys, priories, convents, town halls, castle chapels, and sometimes small roadside shrines. No one can quite agree on how precisely every community followed the same rhythm, but the principle was widely understood. Bells divided darkness from dawn, labour from prayer, danger from safety, and ordinary noise from moments demanding attention. The earliest bell might summon monks to matins or lauds. Within a monastery, the sound passed through cloisters where the stones held the night's cold. Brothers rose from simple beds, pulled habits over linen garments, and moved by candlelight toward the church. Sandals brushed the floor, hinges murmured, a lamp flame trembled beneath an arch. Even where silence was required, the bell spoke for the whole community. Beyond the monastery wall, villagers might not know the name of every office sung inside, yet they understood that prayer continued on their behalf. A sounding bell meant that someone was awake, sacred order held, and night had not swallowed the world. If the expected bell failed, anxiety could spread quickly. Perhaps the rope had broken, perhaps the ringer was ill, perhaps fire, storm, or sudden death had interrupted the routine. Some chroniclers claimed that bells possessed more than practical value. They described consecrated bells as voices that drove away demons, scattered storms, and frightened malicious spirits. In certain regions, bells were blessed with water, incense, oil, and solemn prayers. Some even received names. Historians continue to debate how literally ordinary people understood these ceremonies, but a bell was rarely treated as mere metal. Its making required skill, expense, and trust. Bronze had to be cast in careful proportions, often nearby because transporting such weight over muddy roads was difficult. Founders dug casting pits, shaped clay moulds, and fed furnaces with charcoal while assistants watched the molten metal. A flaw could ruin months of work. When a bell finally sounded true, its tone became part of local memory. Villagers learned its voice as they learned the voices of relatives. One bell called them to mass, another marked a funeral. Faster ringing warned of fire or attack. In towns, bells announced the opening and closing of gates, the beginning of markets, and the hour when alehouses should quiet. They might summon citizens to a manor court or signal that strangers had entered under suspicious circumstances. Bell ropes frayed, ringers overslept, wind distorted sound across hills and valleys. In winter, heavy air carried a tone farther, while rain and foliage softened it. A farmer in an outlying field might count 7 strokes and wonder whether he had missed the first. A sleepy sacristan might pull too soon, earning muttered complaints from those whose work depended on the signal. Yet each community knew its own bells, the deep one that seemed to roll beneath the ground, the smaller one with a cracked edge, the chapel bell that fluttered rapidly at noon. Even animals responded. Oxen lifted their heads, dogs barked, birds rose from churchyard yews, circling before settling again among the branches. The Angelus bell invited people to pause and pray. A woman stirring pottage set down her wooden ladle. Men repairing a hedge straightened their backs. A merchant in the market square stopped counting coins while the bell crossed roofs, stalls, and chimneys. The interruption reminded everyone that time belonged not only to labour and trade, but also to heaven. Bells also guarded the boundary of night. Curfew bells told households to cover fires, shut doors, and withdraw from streets. The word itself came from the idea of covering the fire, though customs differed widely. Embers were banked beneath ash until morning. Candles were pinched out to conserve wax or tallow. Oak bars were lowered across doors, and shutters secured against wind and unwanted visitors. When curfew sounded, the village changed character. Voices faded from the market square. Footsteps hurried over packed earth. At the inn, trenches were cleared, ale cups emptied, and travellers directed towards straw mattresses or benches near the hearth. In a castle, gatekeepers checked chains and bolts while guards climbed toward the wall walk, fur-lined cloaks drawn close. Afterward, silence was never complete. Wind moved around stone towers, rain tapped on roofs. Somewhere, a watchman called across a lane, but the bell had declared that the public day was over, making every unexpected noise more noticeable. On stormy nights, bells might ring again. Some communities believed their sound could break hail clouds or turn lightning away from fields and church roofs. Bell ringers sometimes climbed towers during dangerous weather, though the practice exposed them to the very lightning they hoped to repel. Those who recorded the custom never fully agreed whether the ringing was prayer, warning, protection, or all three. There was comfort in the attempt. A storm made the world uncertain. Animals strained at their tethers. Rain entered through thatch, and trees groaned beyond the houses. Against that disorder, the bell offered a human rhythm. Each stroke crossed the dark air and returned as an echo from fields and walls. Late in the evening, when the final service ended in an abbey, the bell sounded over cloisters washed in moonlight. Monks withdrew to their dormitory. In nearby cottages, families settled beneath rough blankets while the fire dimmed among the ashes. The bell's last vibration lingered, almost too faint to hear, and dissolved into the breathing silence of the countryside. That silence felt safe because the bell had prepared it. The hours had been named, duties were completed, gates were shut, prayers spoken, and fires covered. Quiet without the bell could suggest neglect or interruption. Quiet after the bell meant that the world had been placed, at least for a few hours, in order. Once the final bell had faded, the village listened to itself. Quiet did not arrive as an empty space, but as a softer arrangement of familiar sounds. A cartwheel settled beneath a lean-to. A tether chain touched the side of a manger. Someone coughed behind a wattle and daub wall, and a baby stirred before returning to sleep. From the far edge of the settlement came the low movement of cattle packed close together for warmth. These noises mattered because they confirmed that ordinary life continued. A house that creaked was occupied. A dog that barked was alert. A watchman's call meant that someone still walked the lanes while others rested. In a world where darkness concealed almost everything beyond the reach of firelight, sound became a kind of invisible map. Many medieval villages had no formal night watch in the manner of a large town, yet some appointed men to patrol during dangerous seasons, fairs, harvest time, or periods of unrest. Elsewhere, householders took turns keeping watch, especially when rumours of thieves, soldiers, or wolves moved along the roads. No one can quite agree on how regularly these customs were followed, because village records often mention them only after something had gone wrong. The watchman carried little that seemed impressive. He might have a staff, a horn, a lantern shielded against wind, or a wooden clapper whose sharp crack could wake nearby houses. His boots sank into mud between cottages. Rain gathered along the edge of his hood. At intervals, he called out the hour or announced that all was well, though whether all truly was well remained another matter. His voice reassured sleeping households because it placed a human presence inside the darkness. When the call came from the eastern lane, then later from near the churchyard, villagers could follow his progress without seeing him. A long delay invited unease. Perhaps he had stopped to warm himself at an alehouse door. Perhaps he had discovered a broken fence, or perhaps something had prevented him from calling. Dogs formed another layer of protection. Medieval dogs were kept for hunting, guarding livestock, controlling vermin, and warning of strangers. They slept near doors, beneath benches, beside hearths, or in farmyards among tools and barrels. Their barking was interpreted almost like speech. One short burst might mean a fox near the hens. A deeper, repeated bark could indicate a person approaching. A dog that barked wildly and then fell silent was more disturbing than a dog that never barked at all. Silence suggested that whatever had approached was now close enough to be recognized, or close enough to stop the warning. Some villagers believed that dogs could see spirits invisible to human eyes. A hound whining toward an empty doorway might be watched carefully, especially if the fire had begun to burn strangely low. Those who recorded such beliefs never fully agreed on their meaning. Clergy sometimes dismissed them as foolish superstition, while also preaching that demons and restless souls were real dangers. Ordinary people rarely separated official teaching from local tradition with neat precision. A charm tied above a doorway might hang only a few steps from a painted image of a saint. Inside the cottage, families slept near one another. Privacy was scarce, and warmth was shared. Parents, children, servants, widowed relatives, and travellers might occupy the same room, using curtains, chests, or hanging cloth to create small divisions. Straw mattresses released a dry rustle whenever someone turned. Wool blankets smelled faintly of smoke, lanolin, and damp air. Rushes covered some floors, sometimes mixed with sweet-smelling herbs such as mint, lavender, or meadowsweet when a household could obtain them. The fresh layers softened cold ground, though older material beneath might shelter fleas, beetles, and scraps from previous meals. A mouse moving through the rushes was irritating but ordinary. If even the mice seemed still, the household might notice. The hearth added its own rhythm. A covered ember clicked softly beneath ash. Charred wood shifted. Occasionally a spark glowed and vanished. A fire was dangerous, but its presence was comforting. It gave light, warmth, and proof that morning could begin without the labour of striking a new flame. Before sleep, someone often checked that the embers were safely banked and that no loose straw lay too near. A house suddenly silent because the fire had died could feel colder before anyone understood why. A woman waking in darkness might first listen for breathing, then for the faint crackle of the hearth. She could reach for a tinderbox, a small iron tool, or a candle stub kept near the bed. Tallow candles were cheaper than beeswax, though they smoked and smelled strongly. Even a weak flame could restore the familiar shapes of stool, chest, spindle, and hanging cloak. Outside, shutters knocked gently in the wind. Oak doors swelled in wet weather and groaned against their frames. A late traveller approaching the village might call out before knocking so that the household would not mistake him for a thief. At some doors, he might invoke a saint or identify the innkeeper by name. To arrive silently was to risk suspicion. Hospitality existed, but it depended on recognition and signs of peaceful intent. A pilgrim might carry a staff, a broad hat, and a badge purchased at a shrine. Yet badges could be copied, and travellers were not always what they claimed. The person inside listened to the stranger's accent, breathing, companions, and the sounds of animals on the road before lifting the wooden bar. The village also listened for the churchyard. Medieval burial grounds stood close to parish churches and often near inhabited houses. Wind moved through yew trees. Loose branches touched stone walls. Animals crossed between graves, and the uneven earth made ordinary footsteps sound uncertain. Stories told beside winter fires warned of revenants, the restless dead who returned to trouble the living. Some were said to walk heavily, while others arrived without any sound at all. Historians debate how common belief in such creatures truly was, but certain medieval accounts describe bodies being exhumed, restrained, burned, or otherwise treated to prevent their return. Silence near the churchyard could therefore become suggestive. A watchman might prefer the sound of an owl to the absence of every bird. A villager passing after dark might whisper a prayer, touch a pilgrim token, or carry a small piece of blessed wax. These gestures were modest defences against a world that seemed larger at night. Yet most nights passed without spirits, thieves, or wolves. The dog barked because a branch moved. The watchman paused because his shoe had filled with mud. The strange sound near the churchyard belonged to a goat that had escaped its enclosure. Medieval people, like people in every age, lived among fears that were often disproved by morning. Gradually the settlement settled more deeply into sleep. Clouds crossed the moon. Frost brightened the edges of fences. From a distant roof came the soft pattern of rain, light enough not to wake anyone fully. The watchman's footsteps moved past the church, across the market space, and down toward the mill stream. Then his voice rose once more through the darkness, calm and ordinary. A dog answered from behind a gate. Another barked farther away. Within the cottages, no one needed to open a shutter or rise from bed. The familiar chain of sound had been restored. The village remained hidden beneath night, but it was not abandoned. It breathed, shifted, watched, and listened, held together by small noises that told each household the others were still there. Beyond the village, where the road climbed toward higher ground, a castle stood above the fields. Its walls appeared solid beneath the moon, but the life enclosed within them was restless and crowded. Even after the gates were barred and the drawbridge raised, the castle did not fall entirely quiet. Guards crossed the wall walk, horses shifted in the stables, servants carried water, cleared trenches, covered fires, and prepared chambers for the night. A castle was less a silent stone fortress than a tightly packed household. Nobles, soldiers, clerks, cooks, grooms, laundresses, craftsmen, chaplains, messengers, guests, and servants shared the same enclosed space. Their work produced a constant murmur. Boots struck steps, keys turned in locks, chains scraped against gate mechanisms. From the kitchens came the final chopping of herbs, the splashing of greasy water, and the complaints of dogs waiting for scraps. Rushes covered the floors of many chambers, sometimes mixed with lavender, rosemary, or dried flowers. Fresh rushes softened footsteps, though older layers could hide bones, crumbs, insects, and the occasional lost coin. Oak chests stood beside beds hung with curtains, and iron candle holders cast uneven light across plastered walls. Even a wealthy chamber remained full of small sounds, cloth shifting, wood contracting in the cold, and wind pressing through narrow window openings. Because noise was normal, an unexplained silence attracted attention. The gatehouse was especially dependent upon sound. Guards listened for riders before they could see them, recognizing the rhythm of a single horse, a pack train, or a larger armed company. A traveller approaching after curfew was expected to call out and identify himself. The porter might question him through a small opening before allowing the outer gate to move. Someone who waited silently beyond the gate created immediate suspicion. He might be a messenger too exhausted to speak, a pilgrim seeking shelter, or a servant sent from a nearby manor. Yet he might also be watching the guards, counting their number, or waiting for an accomplice inside. No one can quite agree on how often castles faced such secret schemes, but household ordinances repeatedly emphasized locked doors, guarded keys, and controlled entry. Keys were symbols of authority as well as practical objects. The porter, chamberlain, steward, or trusted servant might carry them at a belt. At night, important keys could be brought to the Lord's chamber or placed beneath the care of a senior officer. A missing key was troubling. A door found open without the noise of its hinges or bolt being heard was worse. Castle doors were rarely subtle. They were thick, heavy, and fitted with iron. Their movement announced itself through groaning wood, scraping stone, and clattering latches. Anyone attempting to pass quietly had to move with unusual care. Servants learned which steps creaked, which corridors echoed, and which shutters rattled in the wind. Knowledge of these sounds made the household function, but it also meant that unfamiliar silence seemed deliberate. In the great hall, evening meals could continue for hours. People ate bread, pottage, roasted meat, smoked fish, and sauces sharpened with vinegar or spices. Thick slices of stale bread served as trenchers beneath portions of food. cups passed from hand to hand, and benches scraped across the floor as guests rose. When the meal ended, silence came gradually. Musicians packed away pipes or small harps. Servants gathered trenchers, some of which were given to the poor or fed to dogs. The Lord's household withdrew through separate doors according to rank. A few men remained near the fire, warming ale and speaking in lowered voices. A silent great hall after midnight could feel enormous. The rafters disappeared into darkness. Shields or painted cloths hung motionless against the walls. Dying embers illuminated the legs of tables but left the far corners unseen. A guard crossing that space heard his own breathing and the faint movement of rats beneath the rushes. Castle stories often grew from such moments. A dead lord was said to return along a gallery without footsteps. A murdered servant appeared beside a stair where no candle would remain lit. Some chroniclers claimed that supernatural warnings came through sound, a bell ringing by itself, knocking within a wall, or a voice calling a name. Others believed the most dangerous presence made no sound at all. Historians continue to debate whether these tales were sincerely believed, used to discipline servants, or simply repeated during long winter evenings. Perhaps they served all three purposes. A young page who feared a ghost was less likely to wander into forbidden rooms, and a servant warned about spirits might avoid a staircase reserved for the Lord's family. Silence could also conceal human danger. Castles were places of loyalty, but also rivalry. Lords feared poisoning, theft, secret correspondence, and betrayal. A whispered conversation in a stairwell was suspicious. Yet two people who fell abruptly silent when another approached could appear even more so. Servants were expected to hear much and repeat little. Their work placed them near private chambers, council rooms, and dining tables where important matters were discussed. A chamber servant might know which messenger arrived after dark, which guest quarrelled with the steward, or which noble refused his supper. Silence was part of service, but too much silence could be interpreted as concealment. The castle watch therefore relied on regular signs. Guards challenged one another at appointed points. Passwords might be used during periods of conflict. Fires burned in braziers or watchhouses, and sentries called across towers to prove they remained awake. Falling asleep on watch was a serious offence because it created a gap in the castle's audible defences. If one tower failed to answer another, a guard might be sent to investigate. Perhaps the sentry had taken shelter from the rain. Perhaps he was sharing a cup of ale below the stair. Or perhaps someone had reached him before he could raise the alarm. On the wall walk, the night wind pulled at cloaks lined with wool or fur. The countryside below was almost invisible. A few village hearths glowed faintly beyond the fields. The watchfire snapped, sending sparks upward, and the flag rope struck softly against its pole. Then the expected call passed from the western tower. A second guard answered from above the gatehouse. Those two voices, separated by stone roofs and dark courtyards, reassured the entire fortress. They told the porter that the wall remained guarded, the stable boy that the gate was secure, and the sleeping household that danger had not entered unnoticed. Inside the Lord's chamber, bed curtains were drawn to hold warmth. A servant slept nearby on a pallet, ready to rise if called. A sword might rest within reach, though the locked door and surrounding household were usually more useful protections. Saints' medals, relic fragments, or blessed objects could be kept near the bed, guarding against dangers both physical and unseen. Some people placed charms near thresholds or scratched protective marks into wood and plaster. Church authorities did not always approve, yet such practices endured. Those who used them may not have thought of them as separate from Christian faith. A prayer to a saint and an old protective sign could share the same doorway. As the night deepened, the castle's sounds became fewer but more important. A footstep in a corridor demanded recognition. A bolt moving behind a door invited questions. Silence following a cry could bring servants running with candles, while silence in the wrong tower could wake the captain of the guard. Rain began against the battlements and trickled through stone gutters into the courtyard. Horses settled beneath their blankets. Somewhere near the kitchens, a dog turned twice upon the rushes and lay down again. The watchfire lowered, then brightened as a guard placed another piece of wood upon it. The castle remained awake through small acts of listening. Its walls could stop an army, but they could not explain a silent corridor, an unanswered challenge, or a door opened without permission. Stone offered strength, yet sound offered knowledge, and through the long hours before dawn, knowledge was what allowed the household to sleep. Not far from the castle, beyond a stream crossed by a narrow wooden bridge, an abbey rested in a shallow valley. Its church tower rose above orchards, fish ponds, barns, and low stone buildings arranged around a cloister. By day, the place carried the sounds of labour axes splitting firewood, quills scratching parchment, millstones turning grain, and brothers chanting beneath vaulted ceilings. By night, much of that activity softened into a carefully governed silence. For monks, silence was not simply an absence of speech. It was a discipline, a protection, and a form of attention. Rules differed between religious houses, and no one can quite agree on how strictly every monastery observed them, but many communities restricted conversation after complin. Once the final prayers had been sung, unnecessary words were set aside until morning. The brothers left the church in an ordered line. Their lamps threw small pools of light across worn flagstones. Sandals brushed beneath woolen habits, and the folds of cloth whispered in the passageways. A monk might lower his hood against the cold as he crossed the cloister, but he was not expected to stop for an idle conversation. Silence allowed the mind to settle after the noise of the day. It discouraged quarrels, gossip, complaints, and foolish speech. A careless word could wound a brother, awaken pride, or disturb prayer. Medieval religious writers often described the tongue as a difficult thing to govern, small in the mouth but capable of causing great disorder. Yet the silence of the monastery was never complete. Bells still announced the offices. Water moved through channels beneath the kitchens. Wind touched the cloister arcade. In the dormitory, men coughed, breathed, and shifted on simple beds. The rule controlled human speech, but the building retained its own voice. When communication was necessary, some monasteries used hand signs. These signs varied from house to house and were never universal, but they allowed monks to request common items without breaking silence. A gesture might indicate bread, salt, a knife, a book, or a candle. The sign for fish could imitate the movement of a tail, while the sign for ale might resemble lifting a cup. There was something practical and faintly awkward in these silent exchanges. A monk asking for cheese might be misunderstood as requesting butter. Another might point too urgently toward a jug and receive water when he had hoped for ale. Such moments were probably less solemn than the rules intended, though even mild amusement had to remain restrained. In the refectory, silence often continued during meals. The brothers sat at long tables and ate from bowls or trenchers while one reader spoke from a raised place. The text could be scripture, the life of a saint, a sermon, or an account of a martyr's endurance. The sound of the reader's voice passed over spoons touching bowls, bread being torn, and benches shifting carefully against the floor. Food was plain in many houses, though wealthier abbeys sometimes ate better than their rules suggested. Pottage, beans, onions, eggs, bread, cheese, and fish from monastic ponds were common. Meat might be restricted, especially in the refectory, though the sick, elderly, or travellers could receive exceptions. Historians continue to debate how closely practice followed written ideals, particularly in prosperous communities. The silence of the meal encouraged reflection, but it also demanded awareness. A dropped knife rang loudly. A cough drew every ear. A servant entering through the wrong door became immediately noticeable. In a place where speech was limited, small noises gained weight. The monastery's quiet was considered sacred because it had purpose. It prepared the brothers for prayer and guarded them from distraction. But unstructured silence, especially in darkness, could become uneasy even for those accustomed to it. Medieval monks wrote frequently about temptation. They believed that idle thoughts could enter when vigilance weakened, and some described demons as creatures that exploited solitude, fatigue, hunger, or pride. The most famous danger was sometimes called the noonday demon, a condition of restlessness, boredom, and spiritual exhaustion that made prayer seem unbearable and time move painfully slowly. At night, other fears gathered. A monk rising for matins crossed dark passages while the rest of the household slept. He carried a small lamp or followed the pale glow from a window. The cloister garden lay in shadow, its herbs dark beneath frost or rain. Rosemary, sage, rue, and medicinal plants rested within their beds, while water collected quietly in the central basin. The brother knew the path, every doorway, and nearly every crack in the stone, yet familiarity could make an unfamiliar silence more disturbing. If the infirmary usually contained a cough and tonight did not, he might pause. If the kitchen cat failed to move among the storage jars, he might listen more closely. If the wind ceased suddenly beneath the arcade, the stillness could feel almost watchful. Some monastic tales described spirits appearing in cloisters, chapter houses, or burial grounds. A dead brother returned to request prayers. A sinful monk was seen wandering until his fault was confessed. A mysterious figure sat silently in an empty stall during the night office. Those who recorded such stories never fully agreed whether the appearances were physical, visionary, symbolic, or intended as moral instruction. The dead remained close to monastic life. Brothers were buried near the church, sometimes beneath the chapter house floor or within the cloister garth. Their names were preserved in books of remembrance, and prayers were offered for their souls. Silence near their graves could therefore be peaceful, but it could also remind the living of unfinished penance and uncertain judgment. To protect themselves, monks relied on prayer, holy water, relics, and familiar words from the Psalms. A brother frightened in a corridor might make the sign of the cross. He might whisper the name of Christ, even if the customary silence technically remained in force. Spiritual danger justified speech when ordinary conversation did not. Relics offered particular reassurance. An abbey might possess a fragment of bone, cloth, or another object believed to be connected with a saint. Such treasures were kept in decorated reliquaries and displayed on feast days. Their presence gave the monastery prestige, attracted pilgrims, and was thought to provide protection. Some relics were regarded as powerful against storms, illness, demons, or sudden death. Whether every monk believed each claim literally is impossible to know. Faith, custom, institutional pride, and local memory were woven too closely together to separate easily. The silence of the scriptorium had a different character. During daylight hours, scribes bent over parchment made from carefully prepared animal skin. Quills were trimmed with small knives, ink mixed from substances such as oak galls, and pages held flat beneath weights. The room was quiet because copying demanded concentration, but it was filled with tiny sounds, scratching pens, turning leaves, and the occasional sigh of a tired brother. A mistake could be scraped away with a blade, though the surface never returned entirely to its original state. In the margins, some scribes left brief complaints about cold fingers, poor light, difficult texts, or the welcome arrival of supper. These small remarks remind us that sacred silence did not remove ordinary discomfort. Winter tested the discipline most severely. Cloisters were cold, stone walls held dampness, and candles were expensive. Monks warmed themselves in a communal room when their customs permitted, gathering near a fire while steam rose from wet hems. Elsewhere, they endured the chill with layered wool, patience, and perhaps less silence than the rulebook imagined. Late that night, clouds moved away from the moon. Pale light entered the cloister and lay across the covered walk. From the church came the first movement of a rope, followed by the bell for matins. Its voice passed over sleeping cells, barns, fish ponds, and winter fields. One by one, the brothers rose, doors opened, lamps appeared along the corridor. The silence did not vanish. It changed into footsteps, breathing, and the low beginning of prayer. For them, silence remained both refuge and trial. It created space for devotion, yet it also exposed every anxious thought. It kept harmful speech from the tongue, but left the mind alone with itself, sacred when ordered, unsettling when unexplained. Silence was a threshold upon which holiness and fear could stand very near one another. Beyond the abbey's orchards, the road narrowed beneath trees. In summer, leaves closed above it like a roof, filtering sunlight into small green patches that moved across mud and roots. In winter, bare branches reached over the track while rain collected in wheel ruts and frost hardened the ground into uneven ridges. Travellers entered such woodland knowing that sight would soon become less useful than hearing. A medieval forest was rarely empty. Woodcutters felled branches for fuel. Swineherds drove pigs among oaks to feed on fallen acorns. Charcoal burners tended slow, smoking mounds beneath coverings of turf. Hunters followed deer paths, while gatherers searched for nuts, berries, mushrooms, bark, and medicinal plants. Yet these workers could be scattered far apart, hidden by dense undergrowth and rolling ground. A person walking through the trees listened constantly, the tapping of a woodpecker, the snap of a twig, the rustle of a small animal beneath dead leaves, and the distant stroke of an axe all helped place the living world around him. When those noises ceased, the forest seemed to change shape. No one can quite agree on how extensive medieval forests truly felt to ordinary travellers. Many were not untouched wildernesses, but legally defined hunting territories containing villages, fields, grazing land, and cultivated clearings. Even so, the stretches between settlements could feel immense when crossed on foot, especially in rain, mist, or early darkness. The word forest often described land governed by special laws protecting game and woodland resources. A peasant might live within the legal boundary while remaining forbidden to hunt the deer moving near his own crops. Taking a stag, cutting certain trees, or gathering wood without permission could result in fines or harsher punishment, depending on time and place. Poaching therefore required silence. A man searching for forbidden game moved slowly, avoiding dry branches and keeping dogs under control. He might use a bow, snare, net, or concealed pit. Yet the very stillness needed for poaching made the woods suspicious to foresters and gamekeepers. A clearing without birds, or hounds that suddenly raised their noses, might suggest that someone had passed moments earlier. Hunters also read silence as information. Deer, boar, and wolves disturbed other creatures as they moved. Birds gave warning calls, small animals fled. When the forest grew quiet in one direction, the hunter might stop and wait, wondering whether a large animal stood beyond the next rise. Wild boar inspired particular caution. Strong, quick, and capable of injuring dogs and men, a cornered boar could turn suddenly upon its pursuers. Hunters used heavy spears fitted with crosspieces to prevent the animal from driving itself too far along the shaft. Before such danger appeared, there might be only a low movement among leaves, followed by a stillness that seemed too complete. Wolves occupied an even larger place in medieval imagination. Their numbers and behaviour varied greatly across regions and centuries, and historians continue to debate how frequently they threatened humans. They certainly attacked livestock, which was enough to make their presence feared. A shepherd hearing sheep fall silent might rise immediately, staff in hand, before any growl reached him. Livestock usually made noise while feeding or settling. Sheep cropped grass, bells moved at their necks, and goats rustled among shrubs. If the flock pressed close together without sound, something might be watching from the tree line. The shepherd's dog sensed the tension, lifting its head and listening toward a place the human eye could not yet distinguish. Some shepherds carried horns to summon help, others built fires or hung small bells among the animals. Firelight, human voices, and metal sounds were thought to discourage predators, whether natural or supernatural. A quiet flock in darkness meant that the invisible boundary around the camp had been disturbed. Travellers had similar protections. A pilgrim crossing woodland might sing a hymn, recite prayers, or walk with companions whose conversation announced their presence. Merchant trains used harness bells, partly to keep track of pack animals and partly to signal movement around bends. A solitary person sometimes struck a staff against the ground, allowing each measured knock to break the silence. This noise was not always wise. Robbers could hear a traveller approaching long before he arrived. Roads through forests offered concealment, especially where vegetation crowded close to the track. A fallen tree could be used to halt a cart. A false cry for help might draw someone from the safer path. A silent road ahead could mean that ordinary travellers had been frightened away. Brigands appear often in medieval stories, though the records leave uncertainty about how common organised roadside robbery truly was. Some attacks were committed by desperate labourers or dismissed soldiers. Others involved local men who knew exactly where roads narrowed, where bridges slowed traffic, and which merchants travelled after market day. Those carrying money tried not to appear wealthy. Coins could be stitched into clothing, hidden beneath saddle padding, or divided among companions. Pilgrims sometimes carried purses tucked beneath cloaks, though badges displayed on hats and mantles made their purpose obvious. A person returning from a celebrated shrine might possess souvenirs, letters, or offerings that attracted thieves. Roadside shrines offered reassurance, a simple wooden cross, a painted image beneath a small roof, or a heap of stones beside a spring reminded travellers that others had passed before them. Some left coins, bits of cloth, flowers, or pins. Others touched the shrine, whispered a prayer, and continued without stopping. Springs within forests acquired reputations for healing. Water might be associated with a saint and used to wash sore eyes, aching limbs, or skin complaints. Yet older customs sometimes remained around these places. Strips of fabric were tied to branches, or small objects left nearby as offerings. Church authorities occasionally accepted such practices and occasionally condemned them. Even now, historians continue to debate where devotion ended and superstition began. The traveller himself may not have recognised a boundary. He could pray to a saint, drink from the spring, tie a thread to a branch, and consider every act part of the same hope for protection. Other beings were said to inhabit the woodland. Stories spoke of fairies, wild men, ghosts, and spirits that misled travellers. A person might hear his name called from deep among the trees. Though no companion stood there, some traditions warned against answering an unseen voice, especially after sunset. The most unsettling tales described places where ordinary sound disappeared. Birds stopped, wind no longer moved the leaves. Even footsteps seemed strangely muffled. Such silence could indicate enchanted ground, a hidden gathering, or the nearness of something that did not wish to be seen. Clergy might explain these fears as demonic deception, while villagers preserved older names and customs. A traveller unsure of the path could protect himself by making the sign of the cross, carrying a blessed medal, or repeating a familiar prayer. Some kept herbs such as vervain, rue, or St. John's wort among their belongings because these plants were believed to resist harmful influences. Practical remedies accompanied spiritual ones. Travellers carried bread, hard cheese, onions, dried meat, or smoked fish in cloth bags. Ale or weak wine filled flasks when clean water was uncertain. A cloak doubled as a blanket, and bundles of straw could be stuffed beneath the body during a night outdoors. If darkness overtook a group before they reached an inn, they searched for a clearing sheltered from wind. Firewood was collected while light remained. Animals were tethered close, and one companion might stay awake while the others rested. Conversation continued longer than necessary because voices made the forest feel less near. The fire snapped, sending smoke between tree trunks. Beyond its light, darkness held every shape without revealing distance. An owl called once. A horse shifted and pulled against its rope. Someone turned a piece of bread over the coals, warming it before eating. Then the owl stopped. The listeners did not speak immediately. They heard embers settling, leather creaking, and their own breathing. One man reached for his staff. Another placed a hand near the knife at his belt. Perhaps a fox had passed below the trees. Perhaps an unseen traveller had noticed the fire. Perhaps nothing had changed except the owl's interest in calling. After a while, leaves rustled along the slope. A small animal moved through them and disappeared. The horse lowered its head again. Conversation resumed, quieter than before, and the tension slowly loosened. Above the camp, branches moved beneath a cold wind. Far beyond the trees, an abbey bell marked an hour too distant to count clearly. Its voice arrived weakened but recognisable, reminding the travellers that fields, roofs, and candlelit rooms still existed beyond the forest. Until morning, they remained close to the fire, grateful for every ordinary sound that returned. Beyond the forest, the road descended toward a region marked by older conflict. Low earthworks crossed the fields. A ruined watchtower stood beside a stream, its upper stones missing and ivy climbing through the empty windows. Villagers still worked the surrounding land, but people remembered which paths soldiers had once taken, where barns had burned, and where riders had appeared without warning. War rarely announced itself with a trumpet at the village gate. More often, danger arrived through small changes. Travellers stopped using a road. Merchants failed to appear on market day. Smoke rose from a distant ridge where no charcoal burner was known to work. Then came the silence, the absence of carts, bells, grazing animals, or voices from neighbouring fields. For those who had lived through raids, such quiet could be more alarming than distant shouting. Medieval warfare was not limited to great battles between armoured knights. Armies moved slowly and consumed enormous quantities of food, fodder, firewood, and ale. Soldiers took supplies from the countryside, sometimes by organised purchase and often by force. Smaller companies rode ahead to search for provisions, seize animals, gather information, or frighten local communities into submission. No one can quite agree on how often an ordinary village encountered armed men, because the experience varied by region, decade, and political fortune. Yet chronicles, legal records, and petitions repeatedly describe stolen cattle, ruined crops, broken mills, and households forced to feed passing troops. A mounted company could sometimes be heard from far away. Hooves struck hard ground, harness rings clicked. Men called to one another as they guided horses along narrow roads, but experienced raiders also knew when to reduce noise. They wrapped loose equipment, avoided singing, and moved before dawn when villagers were least prepared. A shepherd in an outer field might notice the first sign. Birds rose from a hedge and did not return. A dog stared toward the road without barking. The sheep gathered close together. Beyond the trees, there was no clear sound of riders, only a silence moving closer. He might leave the flock and run toward the village, using a horn or shouted warning to summon others. Church bells could be rung rapidly in alarm, their pattern different from the measured call to prayer. In some places, people carried livestock toward woods, marshes, castle yards, or fortified church enclosures. Grain, tools, and household valuables were hidden wherever time allowed. Coins disappeared beneath hearthstones or inside clay jars buried near walls. Iron implements were lowered into wells. A family might conceal smoked meat in the roof thatch or carry sacks of oats into the forest. Some people buried church vessels and saints' relics to keep them from theft, though those who hid such treasures did not always survive to recover them. There was little order during these preparations. Hens scattered through doorways, children were lifted onto carts, pigs refused to move in the desired direction. An ox, unimpressed by human urgency, might stop in the lane and block everyone behind it. Even fear had to wait for livestock. The village reeve or priest tried to determine whether the warning was true. A false alarm wasted time and exposed hidden possessions. But waiting too long could mean losing everything. Those who recorded such events never fully agreed on which choice was wiser. Survival depended less on certainty than on acting before certainty became possible. Castles interpreted silence in similar ways. A watchman expected to see farmers in fields, smoke from cottages, and traffic along the road. If these ordinary signs vanished, he informed the gatehouse. The disappearance of local people suggested that they knew something the garrison did not. Guards watched for reflected sunlight on helmets, dust rising behind hedges, or birds disturbed along a distant lane. At night, they listened for shovels striking soil, ladders being moved, or men whispering beneath the walls. An attacker approaching quietly could be more dangerous than one shouting from the road. Passwords were changed during periods of tension. Gatekeepers admitted fewer strangers. Messengers were questioned closely and sometimes searched for concealed letters. A visitor who hesitated over the name of the local lord or failed to recognize the nearest abbey might be detained until morning. Within the walls, wells were checked, arrows counted and stores inspected. Barrels of ale, salted meat, dried peas, beans, oats, and flour determined how long a household could resist isolation. Servants carried stones toward the battlements. Smiths repaired hinges, locks, and metal fittings while carpenters strengthened doors with fresh beams. Noise filled these preparations, but once darkness came, the castle became deliberately quiet. Fires on exposed walls might be reduced. Orders passed in low voices. Men avoided unnecessary movement near crenellations, where their shapes could be seen against the sky. The defenders listened into the darkness, hoping to hear what the attackers tried to hide. Sieges produced strange soundscapes. By day, there might be hammering, shouted insults, arrows striking timber, and stones crashing against walls. By night, the sudden absence of these noises could suggest rest, retreat, or secret work. Attackers dug mines beneath walls, filled ditches, constructed engines, or moved ladders under cover of darkness. A silent enemy camp was therefore troubling. If no songs rose from the soldiers, no horses neighed, and no cooking fires flickered, perhaps the army had departed, or perhaps it was gathering near a weak section of wall. Historians continue to debate how effective surprise attacks were against well-guarded castles, but fear of them shaped defensive routines. Sentries challenged shadows, patrols inspected gates and posterns, bowstrings were kept dry beneath leather coverings, Buckets of sand and water stood ready near wooden roofs. Fire was among the most feared dangers. Castles and towns contained enormous quantities of timber, straw, cloth, oil, and dry fuel. A small flame in the wrong place could spread through workshops, stables, and houses before anyone understood its source. Ordinary fire made noise. People shouted, bells rang, animals cried, and roof timbers crackled. But the beginning of a fire might be silent, a smouldering bundle pushed beneath a door, a candle overturned in an empty room, or embers carried by wind into dry thatch. Night watchmen looked not only for flames, but also for unexpected stillness. A tavern that became quiet too early might conceal a quarrel, theft, or plot. A stable where horses no longer moved might suggest smoke already filling the air. A guard who failed to answer could have fallen asleep, but he might also have been overcome before raising an alarm. In towns, as gates closed at set hours and late arrivals waited outside unless someone trusted them. Narrow streets became dark once candles and lamps were extinguished. Watchmen walked with staffs, lanterns, or halberds, calling the hour and checking for fire. Certain towns required householders to keep water available. Others regulated ovens, forges, and candles. Bakers and brewers worked with heat before dawn, and their buildings were watched carefully. Some communities forbade carrying naked flame through streets unless it was protected inside a lantern. A thief depended upon silence. He lifted latches carefully, cut purse strings, or entered through roofs and rear yards. Yet medieval houses rarely offered perfect quiet. Doors scraped, dogs barked. Sleeping families lay close together, and unfamiliar movement could wake an entire room. When a victim discovered theft, the expected response was loud. The hue and cry summoned neighbours to pursue the offender. Anyone hearing the call might be required to join, bring a weapon, block a road, or alert the next settlement. Bells, horns, and shouting transformed private harm into public action. To remain silent during such an alarm could appear suspicious. Perhaps the quiet household had not heard. Perhaps its members were afraid. Or perhaps the thief had friends inside. The same uncertainty surrounded political violence. Noble feuds, disputed inheritances, and local rivalries could divide communities. Men gathered privately in manor halls, exchanged sealed letters, and promised support. Whispering suggested conspiracy, but sudden quiet when a servant entered suggested it even more strongly. A lord's household learned to read pauses in conversation, a messenger who answered too carefully, a knight who avoided the great hall, or retainers who left before dawn could become the subject of concern. Silence was rarely proof, but it invited watchfulness. Late that evening, rain moved across the old earthworks and softened the road. In a nearby manor house, the oak door had been barred. Servants slept beside the hall fire while two men kept watch beneath the porch. Their spears leaned against the wall, and their cloaks smelled of wet wool. For a long time, only rain could be heard. Then came the faint sound of hooves beyond the gate. The guards stood without speaking. The rhythm stopped, leaving the night still once more. One man reached for the lantern while the other lifted his spear. They waited for a call, a name, or some sign of peaceful intent. At last! A voice came from the darkness. It belonged to a known servant from a neighbouring estate, carrying warning that armed riders had been seen near the river road. The gate opened only far enough to admit him. Behind it, the manor began to wake. Firelight brightened. Boots crossed the hall. A bell rope was pulled in the small chapel, sending urgent sound across the wet fields. Silence had carried the first warning, but sound would gather the living together. The warning bell from the manor travelled only so far. Beyond the fields, its sound thinned among hedges, damp meadows, and scattered trees until it became difficult to distinguish from the wind. In the farther cottages, some sleepers woke and listened. Others heard nothing at all. Between one household and the next, darkness kept its secrets. Medieval people feared many dangers that carried recognizable sounds. Wolves disturbed livestock. Thieves tested latches. Storms moved through branches before reaching the roof. Yet the most troubling beings in stories were sometimes those that arrived without footsteps, breath, or any disturbance of the ground. A ghost that rattled chains could be heard and located. A silent presence offered no such comfort. Belief in returning spirits took many forms. Some dead were thought to appear because they needed prayers, repayment of a debt, correction of an injustice, or burial in consecrated ground. Others returned because their sins had not released them. No one can quite agree on how literally every medieval listener accepted such tales, but they appeared in sermons, chronicles, saints' lives, household stories, and monastic collections. The dead were not always imagined as pale and transparent. Some accounts described them as solid figures wearing familiar clothing. A deceased neighbour might be recognised by his cloak, belt, posture, or old injury. In other stories, the dead appeared dark, swollen, or strangely preserved. They might walk roads, enter houses, sit beside beds, or stand silently near the place where they had died. A person who saw such a figure did not always scream. Sometimes the witness was too frightened to move. Sometimes the apparition raised a finger to demand silence. Some chroniclers claimed that spirits spoke only after being questioned in the name of God. Until then, they waited without motion, forcing the living person to decide whether the shape was human, dream, deception, or something beyond ordinary explanation. The Church taught that souls faced judgment after death, and prayers for the departed were considered acts of mercy. Monasteries maintained lists of benefactors and deceased brothers whose names were remembered during worship. Families paid for masses, gave alms, or endowed candles so that prayers might continue after a person's burial. Such practices offered structure to grief. Death did not end the relationship between living and dead. The living could help through prayer, and the dead might appear to request that help. Yet this closeness also meant that silence around a grave, chamber, or abandoned road could feel inhabited rather than empty. Sudden death was especially unsettling. A traveller murdered beside a forest path, a servant lost in a river, or a soldier left without burial after a skirmish might be thought unable to rest. Roadside crosses sometimes marked places of death. Passers-by paused to pray, place a stone, or make the sign of the cross. Some carried small devotional objects for protection, a pilgrim badge, a piece of blessed wax, a written prayer folded into cloth, or a medal associated with a saint. Others relied on customs that church authorities regarded with suspicion. Iron objects were sometimes placed near thresholds. Herbs were hung above doors. Protective marks were carved into beams, window frames, or hearthstones. The meaning of these signs is not always certain. Historians continue to debate whether every scratched symbol was magical, religious, practical, or merely decorative. A carpenter's mark could resemble a charm. A protective design might later be copied by someone who no longer understood its origin. Within many households, however, the doorway remained a place of concern. It separated the known interior from the uncertain night. Doors were barred with oak beams, but people also sought spiritual defences. A sprig of rowan, a cross made from palm leaves, or a small relic might be placed nearby. Windows, chimneys, and keyholes were other vulnerable openings. Smoke left the house through the roof, but harmful things might also enter by the same path. Some people believed spirits could slip through spaces too narrow for a body, arriving without moving a latch or disturbing a sleeping dog. The hearth therefore carried protective meaning. It was the household's centre where food simmered, clothing dried, and stories were told. Ashes were sometimes examined for signs, and embers were carefully covered before sleep. A fire that extinguished without explanation could provoke unease, especially when every candle also burned low. In one winter tale, a family sitting around the hearth heard nothing outside, though snow usually fell from the eaves and wind pressed against the shutters. The dog crawled beneath a bench. The flame narrowed until the room seemed colder. Then a figure appeared beside the oak door without opening it. Those who recorded stories of this kind rarely agreed on details. In one version, the figure was a dead relative asking that stolen property be returned. In another, it was a demon imitating the dead. The important moment was often the silence before the appearance, as though the ordinary world had withdrawn to make space for something else. Demons were believed to deceive through false shapes, voices, dreams, and temptations. Clergy warned that not every apparition should be trusted. A spirit claiming to be a deceased parent might encourage despair, pride, or forbidden practices. The safest response was prayer, holy water, the sign of the cross, or the presence of a priest. Priests sometimes blessed homes after illness, death, or reported disturbances, They carried a cross, a book, and holy water, sprinkling doorways, beds, and walls while reciting prayers. If the household owned candles blessed at Candlemas, these might be lit during storms or moments of fear. Not every unseen being belonged to formal Christian teaching. Villagers also told stories of fairies, household spirits, and mysterious women encountered near wells, mounds, crossroads, or ancient trees. Names and customs varied widely. Some beings were generous if respected, while others punished intrusion, careless speech, or broken promises. Fairy gatherings were sometimes recognised by music in the distance. More frightening was the place where music stopped as a traveller approached. A ring of flattened grass, a silent hill, or a path that seemed suddenly unfamiliar could suggest that the traveller had entered ground belonging to someone else. Some traditions warned against eating food offered by strange hosts, revealing one's true name, or speaking too freely after sunset. Silence could protect the traveller by preventing an unwise answer, yet silence could also show that the unseen beings had noticed him. Crossroads gathered many such fears. They were practical meeting points, places where travellers exchanged news and chose between uncertain roads. They were also associated with burials, executions, boundary markers, and beings that belonged nowhere entirely. A traveller reaching a crossroads at dusk might find a small shrine, a weathered cross, or stones arranged near the verge. He could stop to adjust his cloak, eat a piece of bread, and listen for traffic. If no cart approached, no bird called, and no wind moved through the hedge, the choice of road became heavier. People used spoken prayer to break such silence. The Lord's Prayer, the Ave Maria, a saint's name, or a line remembered from worship could restore confidence. Words placed the traveller within a sacred order and declared that he did not pass through darkness alone. There were also stories of the restless dead making noise beneath the earth. Knocking came from graves. Groans sounded beneath church floors. Corpses were said to chew their burial shrouds, bringing sickness to surviving relatives. In some regions, graves were reopened when unexplained deaths followed one another in a family. Bodies might be pinned, turned, decapitated, burned, or otherwise restrained. Such practices were not universal, and many clergy opposed them, but archaeological discoveries suggest that unusual burial treatments did occur. Even now, historians continue to debate which burials reflect fear of revenants, and which resulted from punishment, disease, accident, or local custom. The greatest terror was not always the body itself, but the silence surrounding repeated misfortune. A household lost one member, then another. Livestock weakened. The hearth smoked badly. No clear cause appeared. In the absence of explanation, people searched memory for quarrels, broken promises, improper burials, or neglected prayers. At the abbey, monks might be asked to sing masses for the dead. At the parish church, candles were placed before saints. A priest visited the graveyard at dawn. These actions brought voices, bells, incense, and movement into places made frightening by uncertainty. Late at night, moonlight crossed the manor chapel floor. The warning bell had stopped, and the household once again lay behind barred doors. A servant sleeping near the hall fire woke because the dog had raised its head. The animal stared toward the passage but made no sound. For several moments, the servant listened. The rushes did not stir. No latch moved. The watchmen outside continued their slow conversation beneath the porch. Then the dog lowered its head, and the fire shifted among the ashes. Nothing entered the hall. Perhaps nothing had approached it. Still, the servant whispered a prayer before closing his eyes, because silence did not need to reveal a danger in order to be feared. Sometimes it was enough that it left room for one. Beyond the manor chapel, animals settled beneath roofs, in pens, and behind woven fences. Their presence filled the darkness with small signs of life. Cattle breathed heavily in the byre, sheep pressed together beneath damp wool. Hens shifted along wooden perches, while horses stamped against straw and shook their bridles when dreams or insects disturbed them. Medieval households lived close to animals and depended upon them so completely that changes in their behaviour were rarely ignored. A cow provided milk, hides, manure, and sometimes the strength to pull a cart. Sheep supplied wool and meat. Pigs transformed acorns, scraps, and woodland forage into food that could be salted for winter. Chickens gave eggs, while geese guarded yards with a noise that few strangers could escape. The sounds of these animals formed part of the household clock. Roosters announced morning, though not always with the precision later stories gave them. Cows lowed when they expected milking. Pigs protested at feeding time. Dogs barked at movement beyond the door. When a familiar animal became strangely quiet, people noticed because routine had been interrupted. No one can quite agree on how much medieval people believed animals could predict danger. Practical experience certainly taught them that livestock sensed smells, vibrations, weather, and predators sooner than humans sometimes did. Around this observation grew a larger body of belief in which animals recognized sickness, death, spirits, and divine warning. Birds received particular attention. Their cries, flight, and seasonal arrival shaped agricultural life. Swallows nesting beneath eaves were sometimes welcomed as signs of good fortune. Ravens and crows gathered around battlefields, gallows, refuse heaps, and newly ploughed land, becoming associated with death even though they were simply skilled at finding food. An owl calling near a house might be interpreted as an omen, though meanings differed from place to place. Some believed it warned of death. Others treated it as an ordinary hunter of mice. Those who recorded such beliefs never fully agreed, and a household could hold both explanations at once, especially when an owl called during illness. Silence among birds could be even more unsettling. A hedgerow that had been loud with sparrows and finches might suddenly become still when a hawk circled overhead. Woodcutters and shepherds learned this pattern without needing supernatural explanations. Yet if the birds vanished while the sky remained empty, older fears found room to grow. A traveller might pause beneath a tree and listen. Perhaps a fox moved through the grass. Perhaps riders waited beyond the bend. Perhaps a storm pressed close while still hidden behind hills. In some stories, birds fell silent when a harmful spirit crossed the road, as though creatures without speech recognized what humans could not. Farm animals were also believed to behave strangely before storms. Cattle gathered near hedges. Sheep turned their backs to wind. Horses became restless, pulling at ropes and rolling their eyes toward darkening skies. Swallows flew low when insects remained near the ground, and ants moved their eggs away from damp earth. Such observations could be useful, though they were not always reliable. Medieval weather forecasting combined experience with saints' days, proverbs, moon phases, cloud shapes, and inherited custom. Some farmers watched whether rain fell on particular feast days, believing it foretold weeks of wet or dry weather. Historians continue to debate how seriously these sayings guided work, but harvest decisions were too important for any possible sign to be dismissed lightly. Thunderstorms brought both practical and spiritual fear. Animals sensed the pressure and noise before the storm reached the village. Horses strained in stables. Dogs hid beneath benches. Poultry gathered under carts and sheds. If the usual animal noise suddenly stopped, householders might look toward the church tower, waiting to hear bells rung against the storm. People sometimes placed blessed branches, candles, or herbs in stables to protect livestock from lightning and disease. Palm from Palm Sunday might be fixed above a doorway. Holy water could be sprinkled over stalls. A small cross was carved into a beam, or a saint's image hung near harnesses and tools. These protections existed beside remedies drawn from folk practice. A sick cow might be given herbs in ale, rubbed with salt, smoked with aromatic plants, or led around a sacred place. Charms could be spoken over water before it was poured into a trough. Clergy often objected to words they considered magical, though distinguishing prayer from charm was not always easy. The loss of an animal could ruin a family. A dead ox meant fewer fields ploughed. A sick cow meant less milk for children and no surplus for market. When several animals weakened together, people searched for spoiled fodder, poisonous plants, foul water, weather, infection, or malice. Cattle disease sometimes spread through whole regions, leaving fields empty of their usual lowing. Medieval records describe outbreaks that killed large numbers of animals. Though identifying the exact diseases is difficult, no one can quite agree whether every reported moraine referred to the same illness, or to several different infections grouped beneath one fearful name. A silent buyer during such an outbreak felt unnatural. The absence of chewing, chains, and heavy breathing made the building seem abandoned before the animals were removed. Families entered carrying lamps, touching hides, checking mouths and searching for signs that might offer an explanation. Some suspected witchcraft or the evil eye, especially when one household suffered while a neighbour's animals remained healthy. A quarrel over pasture, a refused loan, or an insult at market could be remembered and reinterpreted. An old woman who knew herbs might be asked to cure the animals one day, and accused of harming them the next. The records rarely reveal what the accused truly believed or practiced. Many healers relied on knowledge passed through families which leaves soothed swelling, which roots encouraged appetite, and which mixtures were dangerous. Yet healing rituals could include whispered words, knots, marked bread, or objects buried beneath thresholds. Animals also carried meaning around death. Dogs were said to howl before someone died. Horses resisted passing certain graves. Bees required special attention. In parts of medieval and later rural Europe, households believed bees should be informed when their keeper died, married, or left home. The precise age of every version is uncertain, but the custom reflected the sense that bees belonged to the moral life of the household. Bees were valuable for honey and wax. Honey sweetened food and entered medicines, while beeswax candles burned more cleanly than tallow and were essential in wealthy churches. A hive that became silent could mean cold, starvation, disease, the loss of its queen, or the collapse of the colony. The beekeeper approached carefully, listening before opening the woven skep. A healthy hive carried a low, continuous hum. The sudden absence of that sound was ominous because it announced loss before anybody was seen. Monastic gardens often kept hives near orchards and herb beds. Brothers watched the bees move among apple blossom, lavender, thyme, and sage. Some writers admired their orderly labour and used the hive as an image of disciplined religious community. Each bee worked without argument. Though a real beekeeper might have considered this comparison more peaceful than the insects themselves. At night, dogs remained the household's most immediate listeners. A dog might sleep beside the door but wake at a faint movement beyond the wall. Its bark gave warning, but its refusal to bark could be equally meaningful. Perhaps the approaching person was familiar. Perhaps the animal was frightened. Perhaps it had been distracted with food. Thieves sometimes feared dogs more than locks. Stories claimed they used herbs, charms, or drugged meat to silence them, though it is difficult to know how often such methods were actually attempted. A household waking to find its dog quiet and the door open might suspect more than ordinary theft. Cats, though less celebrated in records, kept grain stores and kitchens free of rodents. Their movements in darkness were familiar to servants sleeping near storerooms. If a cat hissed toward an empty corner, people might look for a snake, rat, stranger, or spirit. If it fled entirely, that too could seem like warning. Near dawn, the manor's stable boy woke beneath a rough wool cloak. The horses had stopped shifting. For a moment, the stable was so still that he could hear rainwater dripping from the eaves into the yard. He raised his head. One horse stood rigid, ears turned toward the outer wall. Another breathed through widened nostrils but made no sound. The boy reached for the lantern, shielding the flame as he crossed the straw. Outside, something moved beside the fence. It was not a spirit, nor a raider, nor a wolf. A section of wet earth had collapsed beneath the weight of the rain, loosening a post and allowing a young cow to wander from its enclosure. The horses had heard it before the boy did. He led the cow back through the mud, repaired the opening as well as darkness allowed, and returned to the stable with cold fingers. Soon the animals resumed their ordinary movement. Leather creaked, a hoof struck wood. One horse lowered its head toward hay. The stable's familiar sound returned like warmth. Across the fields, the first birds began to call from the hedges. Their voices spread gradually toward the village, the abbey, and the distant castle walls. Another night had passed without the omens becoming true, yet the people who woke beneath those sounds would continue listening. Animals could not explain what they sensed. That was what made them useful, and what made them frightening. Their silence offered a warning without a name, leaving human beings to choose whether danger came from weather, illness, hunger, predators, strangers, or the unseen world. As morning light reached the stable roof and the first birds began calling from the hedges, another kind of silence settled inside the manor house. It gathered not in the courtyard or along the walls, but in a small upper chamber where the shutters remained closed against the cold. A servant had been ill for several days, and the household had learned to listen for every change in her breathing. Sick rooms were rarely private places. A patient might lie in a curtained bed while relatives, servants, neighbours, healers, priests, and curious visitors moved in and out. A bowl of water stood nearby, cloths dried beside the hearth, bundles of herbs hung from pegs, filling the room with the scents of sage, rosemary, rue, fennel, or whatever the household believed might help. The air could also smell of smoke, sweat, damp wool, vinegar, spilled ale, and the tallow candle burning near the bed. Rushes on the floor were changed when possible, though illness often interrupted ordinary cleaning. A stool held wooden cups, spoons, strips of linen, and a small pottery vessel containing some remedy prepared in the kitchen below. Medieval people did not understand infection as modern medicine does, but they watched illness closely. They noticed heat in the skin, colour in the face, swelling, coughing, thirst, confusion, and changes in urine. Physicians, when available and affordable, examined the pulse and studied urine held in a clear glass vessel. The colour, sediment, and appearance were believed to reveal disturbances within the body. No one can quite agree on how often ordinary villagers consulted trained physicians. In many places, care came from family members, local healers, midwives, monks, barber surgeons, or experienced neighbours. The boundary between professional medicine, household knowledge, and religious practice was not fixed. A woman tending the sick might prepare a drink of warm ale mixed with herbs. Honey could soothe the throat. Broths made from chicken, onions, barley, or roots offered nourishment when solid food could not be swallowed. Vinegar was used in the washing and fumigation, and while aromatic plants were burned to cleanse corrupted air. Some remedies were gentle, others were exhausting. Bloodletting was used to rebalance the humours, sometimes by opening a vein and sometimes through leeches. Cupping drew blood or fluid toward the surface of the skin. Purging remedies emptied the bowels and emetics forced vomiting. Historians continue to debate how frequently these treatments worsened illness, though medieval healers often believed that failing to act was more dangerous than acting imperfectly. Prayer surrounded all of it. Saints were associated with particular diseases, injuries, and parts of the body. A patient with fever might be carried a relic, touched with blessed cloth, or given water that had washed a sacred object. Candles were promised at shrines in exchange for healing. Pilgrim badges from distant holy places were placed near the bed or dipped into a drink. The sick room therefore held many voices. A healer asked questions, a priest recited prayers, family members whispered about food, money, and whether the patient recognized them. The patient moaned, coughed, or called for water. Servants crossed the floor with basins and firewood. When all these sounds suddenly stopped, those nearby became afraid. Silence might mean that the patient had fallen into restorative sleep. It might also mean unconsciousness, seizure, or the final weakening of breath. Those watching leaned close, uncertain whether the chest still rose beneath the blankets. The breath of a dying person could become irregular. Long pauses appeared between shallow movements. A watcher might believe the last breath had passed, only for another to come moments later. Without clocks precise enough to count seconds, the pause could feel immeasurably long. A feather, polished metal, or the back of a hand might be held near the mouth to detect warmth or movement. Such practices varied, and those who recorded them never fully agreed on which signs were trusted most. A person might also listen for the heartbeat, feel the wrist, or watch the eyes. Death was not always declared quickly. Fear of mistaken burial appeared in later centuries with particular force, but uncertainty around the exact moment of death was much older. A body remained warm, muscles moved, air escaped. The living waited for signs that life had truly departed. When death seemed near, a priest was summoned if one had not already arrived. The dying person might confess, receive the Eucharist, and be anointed with holy oil. Family members gathered as prayers for the departing soul were spoken. A candle, sometimes blessed at Candlemas, could be placed in the patient's hand or near the bed. The sound of prayer was considered important. The soul should not leave the body in abandonment or confusion. Familiar sacred words guided the dying person through fear, even if that person could no longer respond. Some communities rang a bell when death approached. Its strokes invited others to pray. The pattern might distinguish a man, woman, or child. though customs differed widely. The bell carried private suffering into the public soundscape of the parish. A household that heard it paused, a baker stopped kneading dough, a field worker lowered his tool, a woman drawing water from a well crossed herself and whispered a prayer for someone whose name she might not yet know. Inside the chamber, the final silence came gradually. The breathing weakened until the listeners were uncertain whether they still heard it or only expected to hear it. The fire clicked beneath a pot. Rain touched the shutters. A candle guttered, bending its flame toward the bed. Then one of the watchers spoke the patient's name. There was no answer. The priest continued praying, softly at first, then with greater steadiness. The words gave shape to a moment that otherwise felt empty. Without them, the room might have seemed to fall outside time. After death, the body was washed and prepared by relatives, servants, neighbours, or women accustomed to such work. The eyes were closed. The jaw might be supported with cloth. The body was wrapped in a shroud or dressed according to status and custom. Coins were not routinely placed on the eyes in the manner later imagination often suggests, though practices varied across regions and centuries. Herbs or scented plants could be used around the body. Rosemary symbolised remembrance. Incense accompanied wealthier funerals and church rites. In warm weather, burial followed quickly because preservation was difficult. During winter, cold slowed decay, though frozen ground made digging hard. Death changed the sound of a house. Work continued, because fire still needed tending and animals still needed feeding, but voices lowered, benches were moved, water was carried, someone went to notify the priest, relatives, or village officials. The bed where the person had died became an uneasy place. Blankets were washed or aired when possible. Straw from the mattress might be burned or replaced, especially after contagious illness. Some households believed that possessions of the dead should be handled carefully, for they retained memory and perhaps influence. Clothing was valuable and rarely discarded without reason. It might pass to relatives, servants, or the poor. Yet objects connected with a troubling death could inspire fear. A comb, cup, or cloak might remain untouched because no one wished to be the first to claim it. Illness could silence entire communities. During epidemics, familiar sounds diminished day by day. Market squares emptied. Church services changed. Doors remained closed. Mills stopped turning when workers fell sick. Fields went untended, and livestock wandered because no one had strength to guide them. The Great Plague of the 14th century became the most famous example, but medieval people endured many waves of disease before and after it. Fevers, dysentery, respiratory illness, skin diseases, and childhood infections took lives with little warning. Modern historians cannot always identify the diseases behind medieval descriptions. A quiet lane during epidemic carried terrible meaning. It suggested not peace, but absence. No children shouted. No loom beat behind a wall. No smith's hammer struck the anvil. Even dogs seemed fewer, whether because they had wandered, starved, or been driven away. Priests and monks visited the sick when they could, though they too became ill. Burial workers laboured under pressure. Bells rang so often in some places that their voices lost the power to distinguish one death from another. And yet even in those dark periods, people tried to restore sound. Prayers were sung. Processions moved through streets. Psalms were recited beside graves. Families spoke the names of the dead so that silence would not erase them. By evening, the manor chamber had been prepared. The body lay beneath clean linen. A beeswax candle burned more steadily than the earlier tallow flame, giving off a faint sweetness. Outside, wind crossed the winter fields and moved through the leafless trees. From the parish church came a slow bell. Its sound entered the chamber through the shutters, touched the worn furniture, and passed across the still bed. The household listened until the final stroke faded. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was the silence of death, named and witnessed, held within prayer, memory, and the quiet duties that would carry the body toward burial before another night was gone. After the funeral bell faded, the manor returned to its ordinary duties, though ordinary life never resumed all at once. The kitchen fire still required tending, horses still needed oats, the steward still counted sacks of grain, and servants still carried water across the yard before frost hardened the well rope. Yet voices remained lower than usual, and every conversation seemed to pause when someone entered. A manor house depended upon people who knew more than they were expected to say. Chamber servants heard private quarrels through bed curtains, pages carried letters between rooms, grooms noticed which horses were saddled before dawn. Cooks knew which guests refused food, which travellers arrived hungry, and which cups were carried to chambers long after the hall had emptied. Silence was part of good service. A servant who repeated every private word would not remain trusted for long. Household ordinances often praised discretion, obedience, and restraint of speech. Yet the same silence that protected a lord's dignity could also conceal theft, adultery, secret alliances, or plans for violence. No one can quite agree on how often servants used private knowledge to influence their superiors. Most left no written record of what they heard, and surviving accusations were often shaped by fear or rivalry. Still, medieval households were crowded places, and secrets rarely remained entirely private. The steward controlled stores, wages, and household accounts. He inspected bread, ale, candles, fodder, and firewood, comparing what entered the manor with what had been consumed. Wax tablets, parchment rolls, tally sticks, and knotted cords could all help record obligations. A small notch cut into wood might represent a payment, a measure of grain, or work owed by a tenant. Tally sticks were sometimes split lengthwise so that two matching halves proved the same transaction. One portion remained with the creditor and the other with the debtor, because the grain and cuts of the wood could be fitted together. Altering one half without detection was difficult. It was a simple method, but it gave physical form to trust. A missing tally or altered account created suspicion. Perhaps the steward had made an honest error in poor light. Perhaps mice had damaged a parchment. Perhaps someone had quietly removed evidence of grain sold without permission. The manor's stores invited temptation. Salted meat hung in cool rooms. Barrels contained ale, wine, vinegar, or preserved fish. Grain lay in chests and bins, while spices, wax, fine cloth, and metal tools were kept under lock. Servants sometimes received food as part of their wages, but taking beyond the permitted share could be treated as theft. A little flour hidden beneath an apron might feed a hungry family. A candle stub carried from the chapel might provide an hour of light in a cottage. Such acts were small beside noble wealth, yet the household could still punish them harshly because repeated loss threatened the order of supplies. When objects disappeared, the search often began with questions. Who had entered the room? Who held the key? Who remained silent when the loss was announced? A person who spoke too quickly might seem guilty, but someone who refused to speak appeared no safer. Silence could be interpreted as shame, defiance, fear, or loyalty to another person. Without reliable evidence, suspicion moved easily towards servants of low rank, strangers, or anyone already disliked. Some households used oaths to uncover hidden truth. An accused person might swear before a cross, relic, or sacred book that he had not committed the offence. The oath was dangerous because false swearing endangered the soul as well as the body. A person who feared divine punishment might confess even when human witnesses knew nothing. Ordeals had been restricted by church authority by the later Middle Ages, but older ideas about divine judgment remained powerful. People believed that God could reveal guilt through illness, accident, or a sudden inability to speak. Some chroniclers claimed that false witnesses choked on bread or collapsed before a saint's relic. Whether such stories described real events or moral lessons is uncertain. Objects believed to reveal thieves also appeared in folk practice. A sieve might be turned while names were spoken. A key could be placed within a book of scripture and watched for movement. Bread or cheese might be blessed and given to suspects, with the guilty person expected to have difficulty swallowing. Clergy frequently condemned these customs when they appeared magical, but households under pressure still used whatever method promised certainty. Fear made people less patient with uncertainty, and silence offered no clear answer. The manor hall itself encouraged observation. At meals, seating reflected rank. The lord and honoured guests sat at the high table, while retainers, servants, and visitors occupied places farther away. A person seated below his expected position noticed the insult immediately. A cup not offered, a greeting omitted, or a conversation stopped at the approach of one particular man could carry political meaning. Food also revealed relationships, and sharing salt, bread, or a drinking vessel suggested fellowship. Refusing another person's hospitality might signal mistrust. In a world where agreements were often confirmed through ceremony and public gestures, silence at the wrong moment could undo the reassurance those gestures were meant to provide. A visiting knight might arrive with only 2 companions, but be suspected of speaking for a larger group. He removed his wet cloak near the fire, accepted warmed ale, and answered questions about the roads. Yet he might say nothing about why he had come. The Lord's Chamberlain watched his face. The steward noticed the mud on his boots. A groom reported that one horse had been ridden hard and recently reshod. None of these details proved danger, but together they made silence feel deliberate. Private meetings took place in chambers, chapels, gardens, and covered passages where casual listeners were fewer. A lord might speak with a messenger near a window while servants arranged bedding behind a curtain. Letters were sealed with wax, folded tightly, and entrusted to riders expected to protect them. Seals mattered because many recipients could not simply compare handwriting. A damaged seal suggested that a letter had been opened. Messengers carried documents inside leather pouches, beneath clothing, or tucked into belts. Some memorized part of the message in case the parchment was seized. Yet even a sealed letter could be misunderstood. A blank space, an omitted title, or a message unusually brief might suggest anger or secrecy. Those who received such letters often relied on the messenger's spoken explanation, which gave the carrier more power than the silent parchment alone. Servants sometimes became messengers because they knew local roads and could travel without attracting the attention given to armed retainers. A kitchen boy carrying a basket might also carry a folded note beneath the bread. A laundress visiting a nearby estate might repeat a message while appearing to discuss linen or soap. If questioned, such people faced a dangerous choice. Speaking could betray their master. Silence could be treated as confession. Manor courts dealt with disputes among tenants, including unpaid labour, damaged boundaries, stolen animals, broken agreements, and public insults. Proceedings were held before neighbours who knew one another's fields and histories. Jurors presented suspected offences, and silence during these gatherings was rarely neutral. A tenant who failed to answer a summons could be fined. A witness who withheld knowledge might anger the whole community. Yet accusing a neighbour created lasting danger, especially when families shared roads, wells, pasture, and church benches. Many disputes therefore lived for years beneath outward quiet. A boundary stone moved during the night. Sheep entered the wrong meadow. A hedge was cut. Neither household admitted responsibility, but each watched the other across the fields. By late evening the manor hall had emptied, the tables were wiped, the dogs fed, and the benches pushed nearer the walls. A servant scattered fresh rushes mixed with dried meadowsweet across the floor, covering the marks left by wet boots. Outside, moonlight rested on the yard. A watchfire burned near the gate, and the voices of 2 guards rose and fell beneath the porch. Inside, the steward sat alone with a candle and the household accounts. He noticed that 3 measures of grain were missing. For a long while he said nothing. The silence around him was filled with possibilities: hunger, theft, careless counting, hidden charity, or a servant protecting someone weaker than himself. At last, he closed the account roll and lowered the lid of the chest. Morning would bring questions. Tonight? The manor remained quiet, its secrets resting behind oak doors, beneath rush-covered floors, and inside the careful silence of those who knew more than they wished to reveal. The missing grain was discovered before sunrise. When women were already awake in the manor kitchen, one stirred yesterday's embers beneath the ash. Another carried water from the well, her shoes dark with mud. A third kneaded coarse dough beside a narrow window while the cook inspected onions, dried peas, smoked fish, and the remains of a salted ham. Women's work began early and often ended only after the hall had fallen quiet. They brewed ale, baked bread, spun wool, mended clothing, washed linen, tended poultry, gathered herbs, cared for children, prepared bodies for burial, and watched beside the sick. Much of this labour occurred in shared rooms where conversation helped pass the hours. A silent woman therefore attracted attention. Medieval teaching often praised feminine modesty, restraint, and obedience. Preachers warned against gossip, loud laughter, public argument, and speech considered disorderly. Yet a woman who spoke too little could also be viewed with suspicion. Silence might suggest humility, but it might equally suggest resentment. secret knowledge, hidden healing practices, or an intention she refused to reveal. No one can quite agree on how closely ordinary women followed the ideals described in conduct books and sermons. Most women left no written accounts of their own daily speech. Court records preserved their voices mainly when something had gone wrong: a quarrel, accusation, inheritance dispute, broken promise, theft, assault, or suspected crime. These fragments reveal women speaking forcefully in marketplaces, manor courts, workshops, and village lanes. They defended property, accused neighbours, negotiated debts, and repeated rumours. Silence was expected in certain settings, but medieval communities were not filled with women who never spoke. Even so, words carried danger. A careless remark could be described as slander. An accusation made without witnesses might lead to punishment. A woman criticising a powerful household could lose work, protection, or reputation. Sometimes silence was less a sign of submission than a practical shield. Servant women understood this well. A chambermaid might see bruises concealed beneath sleeves, hear a noble couple quarrelling behind bed curtains, or notice a visitor leaving by a side stair before dawn. She was expected to prepare clothing, warm beds with heated pans, empty basins, and ask no unnecessary questions. Her silence protected those above her. It did not always protect her. If scandal emerged, servants could be accused of spreading it even when they had said nothing. A woman who denied knowledge too quickly seemed false. One who lowered her eyes appeared guilty. One who hesitated might be thought to be choosing which secret to preserve. This uncertainty followed women beyond manor walls. At the village well, information passed with buckets, gossip, and household complaints. Women learned who was ill, whose cow had stopped giving milk, which husband had failed to return from market, and which stranger had slept at the inn. The well was both necessary and public. Its worn stones preserved the rhythm of countless hands drawing water. A woman arriving alone and refusing conversation might simply be tired. Yet neighbours could interpret the silence as pride, grief, or concealed anger. Women known for healing occupied an especially uneasy position. Many remedies belonged to ordinary household knowledge. Leaves were crushed for poultices. Honey was mixed into drinks. Warm cloths eased aching joints. Sage, fennel, mint, chamomile, plantain, and other herbs appeared in recipes passed from one generation to another. Some healers treated wounds, fevers, digestive troubles, and women's illnesses. They might know which plants grew near marshes, which roots had to be dug before flowering, and which remedies were too dangerous for children. Such knowledge could earn gratitude, payment, and respect. It could also produce suspicion. A remedy was often accompanied by spoken words. These might be prayers, fragments of scripture, saints' names, or formulas repeated because earlier generations had used them. Clergy sometimes accepted healing prayers while condemning charms that appeared to command hidden powers. The distinction was rarely simple. A woman might recite the Lord's Prayer over a cup of water, tie 3 knots in a thread, and place the thread around a patient's wrist. She could believe all 3 actions belonged to the same Christian hope. Historians continue to debate how many accusations of magical practice grew from real healing customs, and how many arose from neighbourhood conflict. Records often show suspicion gathering around an old quarrel, an unpaid debt, a sick animal, or a child who failed to recover. Silence made such accusations harder to escape. A healer might refuse to reveal the words used in a remedy because they were sacred, inherited, or effective only when kept secret. To her, secrecy protected the practice. To others, it suggested forbidden knowledge. Midwives faced similar uncertainty. Childbirth was usually attended by women, often behind closed doors and away from male authority. The room was warmed if fuel allowed. Shutters were closed against drafts. Linen, water, oil, stools, blankets, and herbs were prepared. Female relatives, neighbours, and attendants offered physical support and prayer. The birthing chamber had its own sounds, low encouragement. Breathing, footsteps, whispered instructions, and sometimes cries heard through the house. Sudden silence inside could make those waiting beyond the door deeply afraid. No one outside knew whether the mother was resting, whether the child had been born, or whether something had gone wrong. Certain customs surrounding birth remained difficult to interpret. Knots might be loosened in clothing to encourage the body to open. Locked chests were sometimes unfastened. Relics, written prayers, or blessed girdles could be placed near the labouring woman. Some monasteries lent sacred objects believed to protect childbirth. A midwife might baptize a newborn in an emergency if the child seemed unlikely to survive before a priest arrived. This gave her a serious spiritual responsibility. She had to speak the proper words and use water correctly. The act was accepted because the salvation of the infant's soul was believed to be at stake. Yet the same closed chamber that gave women authority also made male observers uneasy. What words were spoken there? What remedies were used? What happened if a child was stillborn or born with an unusual condition? Those who recorded such events never fully agreed. Midwives could be trusted witnesses in disputes about birth, legitimacy, or whether a marriage had been physically completed. They were respected for necessary knowledge, yet sometimes questioned precisely because that knowledge was hidden from most men. Women's silence also surrounded grief. Widows were expected to mourn, but the proper expression of sorrow varied. Loud lamentation could be criticized as excessive. Calmness could appear cold. A widow who did not weep publicly might be accused of having wished for her husband's death. Her future depended upon reputation, property, dower rights, household control, and remarriage could all be contested. Relatives watched her conduct closely. Servants listened to conversations. Neighbours noted who visited after dark. A widow might choose silence because every answer could be used against her. Refusing to discuss inheritance, a household conflict, or possible remarriage gave others less material to distort. Yet in a suspicious community, unanswered questions rarely disappeared. They multiplied. In stone churches, women often stood or sat in areas shaped by local custom, sometimes separated informally from men. They prayed before images, lit candles, gave offerings, and listened to sermons that praised holy women for patience and obedience. Among the most admired female saints were those who kept faith under persecution, sometimes refusing to answer powerful men except when declaring belief. Their silence could represent strength rather than weakness. A saint who would not betray a vow transformed quietness into resistance. Ordinary women also used silence to refuse. A wife might stop answering during a quarrel, a servant might pretend not to hear an improper command, a daughter might withhold consent when relatives pressed her toward marriage. Though the practical power of such refusal depended greatly on family and circumstance. Canonical teaching required consent for a valid marriage, yet pressure could be severe. Words spoken at the church door mattered. So did the absence of words. Silence might be taken as hesitation, obedience, fear, or acceptance depending on who interpreted it. Outside, evening gathered around the manor. Women carried the final baskets from the kitchen garden, where leeks, cabbages, onions, and medicinal herbs stood dark beneath the cooling sky. Linen hung stiffly on a line. Smoke drifted low across the yard. Inside the hall, the woman responsible for the grain stores was questioned. She did not deny that the measures were missing. She explained quietly that they had been given to 2 tenant families whose supplies had failed before winter's end. The steward asked whether the lady of the manor had permitted it. The woman lowered her eyes. Her silence answered before her words did. Perhaps she feared punishment. Perhaps she believed charity required no permission. No one can quite agree what judgment such a household would have reached. Much depended on the steward, the value of the grain, and the Lord's concern for his reputation. That night, no thief was found. The steward recorded the missing grain as alms, and warned that future gifts must be approved. The woman returned to the kitchen, where worn tables, blackened pots, and the warmth of the hearth waited for her. Beyond the shutters, rain began softly over the yard. The women worked without conversation for a while, not because silence had defeated them, but because silence sometimes held relief, loyalty, defiance, and mercy all at once. By the time the rain passed, the roads beyond the manor had become dark ribbons of mud. Water filled the deeper ruts, hedges dripped steadily, and small streams crossed the track where no bridge had been built. Travellers waited beneath inn roofs, in church porches, and under the shelter of trees until the weather softened enough to continue. Among them were pilgrims. Some travelled toward famous shrines known across kingdoms. Others walked only a day or two to visit a saint's well, a local relic, or a chapel associated with healing. They carried staffs, leather bags, wool cloaks, flasks, and broad hats that turned rain away from the face. A badge fixed to the hat or mantle announced where the traveller had been or where he hoped to go. Pilgrim badges were often made from inexpensive metal and sold near shrines. Their shapes represented saints, relics, shells, crosses, keys, or the buildings that housed sacred treasures. They were souvenirs, signs of devotion, and sometimes objects believed to carry a trace of the shrine's protective power. A badge did not guarantee good character. Thieves could wear them. Beggars could claim journeys they had never made. Some travellers used the appearance of holiness to gain food and lodging. No one can quite agree how common such deception was, but sermons and local regulations suggest that communities remained cautious even while honouring the duty of hospitality. The road itself provided few certainties. Pilgrims preferred company when it could be found. A group offered conversation, shared food, and protection against robbery. It also made sound. Boots struck the ground in uneven rhythm. Staffs touched stones. Harness bells moved on pack animals. Prayers and songs passed along the line whenever the road grew difficult. Such noise reassured people in isolated places. A farm family hearing pilgrims approach could prepare to offer water or sell bread. An innkeeper knew that paying guests were near. A hermit beside a roadside chapel might ring a small bell, inviting travellers to stop for prayer. Yet there were moments when the road became strangely empty. A pilgrim leaving a busy market town expected to pass carts carrying grain. Women walking toward wells, shepherds moving animals, and labourers repairing hedges. If several miles passed without seeing anyone, the silence began to feel significant. Perhaps the rain had kept people indoors. Perhaps the road ahead was flooded. Perhaps a nearby fair had drawn everyone in another direction. But there were darker possibilities. Robbers sometimes created false emptiness by frightening travellers from a route. An abandoned cart beside the road could be a warning or a trap. A cloak placed in a ditch might belong to an injured person, or it might lure a curious traveller close enough to be seized from the hedge. Experienced pilgrims watched for disturbed mud, broken branches, dropped goods, and the absence of ordinary birds. They listened at bends before rounding them. A group might send one person ahead while the rest waited near a shrine or open field. Some carried knives, though weapons offered limited comfort against several attackers. Wealthier travellers hired escorts or joined merchant caravans. Poor pilgrims relied on numbers, prayer, and the hope that they did not appear worth robbing. Inns provided shelter, but not always safety. A roadside inn could be a timber building with a yard, stable, common room, kitchen, and sleeping loft. Travellers ate pottage, bread, cheese, onions, smoked fish, or whatever the household had prepared. Ale was often safer and more pleasant than uncertain water. Beds might be shared by strangers. Straw mattresses held fleas. Cloaks served as blankets. Boots remained close, and purses were tied beneath clothing before sleep. A pilgrim who heard conversation stop as he entered the common room might wonder whether those inside had recognised his badge, his accent, or the small weight of coins at his belt. Innkeepers were valuable sources of news. They knew which bridges had collapsed, which lords demanded tolls, where soldiers had been seen, and whether illness had entered a nearby village. Some information came through speech, other warnings came through silence. An inn without smoke, animals, or voices was rarely approached without caution. The door might stand open. Benches remained overturned. A cup rested where someone had left it. If no person answered a call, travellers waited outside, afraid that violence or disease had emptied the place. Epidemics changed the meaning of roads. Villages closed gates or blocked lanes with carts and branches. Strangers were turned away. Inns refused guests from infected regions. Local people avoided travellers whose faces appeared pale or whose companions coughed beneath their cloaks. A settlement struck by disease might display no official sign. Its warning was absence. No children played near the ditch. No bread cooled beside an oven. No dogs barked from the yards. Shutters remained closed even after sunrise. A bell might ring slowly, then stop before the travellers reached the church. Historians continue to debate how consistently communities isolated the sick, but fear of contagion could overcome the obligation to welcome pilgrims. Travellers were told to move on, sometimes without water or shelter, those who had come seeking healing found themselves treated as possible carriers of death. Pilgrimage routes also crossed abbey lands, forest tracks, ferry points, and toll bridges. A traveller might sleep in a monastic guest house where a brother received him, washed his feet, and offered bread or broth according to the house's means. Wealthier guests entered more comfortable quarters, while the poor rested in common rooms or outbuildings. The abbey bell gave order to the stay. It marked prayer, meals, and departure. Beyond the guest house wall, monks crossed the cloister in silence, their controlled quiet different from the uneasy stillness of an abandoned road. At dawn, pilgrims resumed their journey after receiving a blessing. Mist lay over the fields. Dew darkened the hems of their cloaks. The road passed a stone cross, then divided near a stand of bare trees. Crossroads encouraged uncertainty even in clear daylight. Wooden signs were uncommon, damaged, or unreadable to many travellers. Directions depended on memory, landmarks, and advice from local people. A wrong turning could add days to a journey. At an empty crossroads, silence became a test. A small shrine stood where the tracks divided. Its painted saint had faded beneath years of weather. Melted candle wax clung to a ledge, and strips of cloth had been tied to a nearby thorn tree. Someone had left a crust of bread and 3 small stones at the foot of the cross. No one can quite agree what every offering meant. Some may have been prayers for safe travel, others could reflect customs older than the shrine itself. The church might condemn certain gestures while travellers continued them, because the road remained uncertain and protection was worth seeking from every permitted source. The pilgrims stopped. One path led through open fields toward a village whose church tower should have been visible, but mist concealed the horizon. The other entered a wooded hollow where the ground appeared less flooded. Neither road carried voices, wheels, livestock, or bells. A woman in the group touched the badge pinned to her cloak. An older man recited a prayer to St. Christopher, widely invoked by travellers. Another examined the mud and found the recent mark of a cartwheel turning toward the fields. They chose that path for nearly an hour. The only sounds were their footsteps, the tapping of staffs, and water dripping from hedges. Then a bell emerged faintly through the mist. It rang once, paused, and rang again. The travellers could not yet see the village, but the sound gave them direction. Soon smoke appeared above low roofs. A dog barked. Men were repairing a fence beside the lane, and a woman stood at a well with a wooden bucket. The ordinary world returned piece by piece. By evening, the pilgrims rested near a stone church while the last light faded across the wet fields. Their cloaks steamed beside the hearth of a crowded guest room. Bread passed from hand to hand, and strangers exchanged news of bridges, tolls, sickness, and safer roads. Outside, the road disappeared into darkness once more. It remained dangerous not because it was always filled with robbers, plague, or spirits, but because silence withheld the knowledge travellers needed: an empty inn, an unanswered call, a soundless village, or a crossroads without guidance forced each pilgrim to decide whether quiet meant peace, abandonment, or warning. And so they travelled with bells, prayers, songs, badges, and companions, carrying sound with them wherever the road became uncertain. The pilgrims carried their sound into the village before sunset. Staffs struck the road, buckles moved against leather bags, and tired voices asked for bread, shelter, and news. Their arrival changed the atmosphere at once. A lane that had seemed empty became inhabited again. Doors opened, dogs barked. Someone called from the well, and the church bell answered from above the roofs. For medieval people, making noise was sometimes a way of reclaiming a place from uncertainty. Sound did not merely announce that danger had passed. It could be used deliberately against fear, storms, illness, wandering spirits, wild animals, and the unseen powers thought to gather around darkness. Bells were the strongest and most public protection. Their bronze voices crossed walls, fields, rivers, and forest edges. They summoned worshippers, marked funerals, warned of fire, and called neighbours together when strangers approached. In moments of danger, ringing transformed isolated households into a community. A thief might silence one witness, but a bell awakened hundreds. During storms, ringers climbed narrow tower stairs while rain struck the roof, and lightning flashed beyond the openings. They pulled ropes with both hands, sending the bell's sound into the clouds. Some believed the consecrated metal could break hail, drive away demons, or turn dangerous weather aside. Others may have understood the ringing mainly as prayer and warning. No one can quite agree on how widely bell ringing was thought to control storms in a literal sense. Church authorities sometimes discouraged the most superstitious claims, especially when ringers endangered themselves. Yet bells continued to sound through thunder because people trusted their voices when the sky seemed disordered. Smaller bells guarded humbler spaces. Handbells could be carried in processions, used at the altar or rung beside the dying. Bells hung from livestock so shepherds could locate animals in mist, woodland, or darkness. A missing bell note warned that a sheep had strayed, become trapped, or fallen prey to a thief or wolf. Some travellers attached small bells to harnesses. The gentle metal sound helped companions follow one another on narrow roads. It also announced peaceful arrival before a stranger appeared from behind a hedge. A traveller who came without greeting, hoofbeat, or bell was more likely to be challenged. Other instruments produced harsher sounds. Wooden clappers, rattles, horns, drums, and metal pans could raise an alarm where no church bell stood nearby. Watchmen carried clappers through streets. Herdsmen used horns across fields. During fire, villagers struck metal objects while shouting for water and ladders. Noise was especially important during communal pursuit. When the hue and cry was raised, anyone within hearing might join. Voices passed from lane to lane. Horns answered from farms. The sound spread faster than a single runner, warning neighbouring settlements to close gates and watch bridges. Religious processions also filled streets with protective sound. Clergy carried crosses, banners, relics, candles, and books while worshippers sang litanies. Such processions might be held during drought, epidemic, war, or fear of crop failure. The route passed through fields, around parish boundaries, or toward a shrine associated with help. The singing gave people something steady to do together. A repeated response required no learned argument and no certainty about what would happen next. One voice began, and the rest answered. Even those who could not read knew the familiar words. Processions blessing fields often stopped near wells, boundary stones, trees, or crossroads. The priest prayed for protection from hail, flood, disease, and failed harvests. Holy water was sprinkled over earth that had to feed the community through another year. Some customs mixed devotion with older local practice. Branches were carried home after blessing and placed above doors or in fields. Small crosses were fixed near crops. Ashes from sacred fires or candles might be preserved for later use. Historians continue to debate how much meaning ordinary participants attached to each gesture. Inside the household, people used quieter sounds against danger. Prayers were spoken before sleep. Parents taught children short phrases to repeat when afraid. A person waking from a nightmare might recite the Lord's Prayer or call upon a favoured saint before leaving the bed curtains. Words mattered because silence could allow imagination to spread without resistance. A prayer named the danger as something subject to divine order. It restored rhythm to breathing and gave the frightened person a beginning, middle, and end to follow. Some spoken protections resembled charms. A healer might repeat sacred names over water, bread, herbs, or a wound. A written prayer could be folded into a small packet and worn near the body. Letters, crosses, and symbols appeared on strips of parchment, scraps of metal, or pieces of cloth. Churchmen distinguished approved prayers from forbidden magic, though the boundary was not always clear to the people using them. A charm could contain scripture beside mysterious words copied by someone who did not understand them. The power might be thought to lie in meaning, sound, writing, sacred association, or all of these at once. Household objects could also be used to create protective noise. Iron tongs struck against the hearth. Knives were placed near doors. Pots and pans were beaten during moments of alarm. In some seasonal customs, villagers made loud sounds to drive away harmful forces, awaken the land, or mark the turning of the year. Those who recorded such customs never fully agreed on their origins. Some were interpreted as Christian celebration. Others preserved older ideas beneath newer names. To the participants, the distinction may have mattered less than the comfort of repeating what parents and grandparents had done. Songs accompanied work because work done in silence could become heavy. Women sang while spinning or preparing flax. Men used rhythmic calls while hauling ropes, raising beams, or moving carts from mud. Repeated lines helped coordinate effort and made the passing hours easier to bear. At harvest, voices carried across fields of wheat and rye. At sea, sailors timed their pulling through song. In monasteries, chant ordered prayer. In inns, travellers exchanged ballads and tales while rain held them indoors. Not every song was solemn, but even simple music established human presence. It told unseen listeners that the road, hall, field, or workshop was occupied. Round winter hearths, stories were spoken aloud, partly because the long darkness invited them. Families repaired tools, carded wool, cracked nuts, and shared bowls of pottage while an older person told of saints, kings, clever peasants, foolish devils, or travellers who ignored warnings. The tale filled the room as surely as firelight. Listeners knew that the ghost at the crossroads or wolf beyond the fence belonged within the story's boundaries. When the ending came, someone added wood to the fire, and ordinary conversation resumed. Children were soothed with lullabies, soft prayers, or repeated promises that doors were barred and dogs remained awake. Adults needed similar reassurance, though they expressed it differently. A guard called the hour, a monk sang a psalm, a widow whispered the names of saints, a shepherd rang a bell before lying beside the flock. Sound could not prevent every danger, bells did not always stop fire, songs did not frighten every robber, charms did not cure each illness, and prayers did not guarantee safe return from a road. Medieval people knew this through experience. Yet these practices gave form to fear. They turned waiting into action and isolation into shared attention. A ringing bell told a frightened household that others had heard. A hymn told mourners that grief could be carried by many voices. A watchman's call told sleepers that darkness had not erased the community. That evening, the pilgrims joined villagers inside the church. Rainwater darkened the stone near the entrance, and wool cloaks steamed in the warmth of gathered bodies. Beeswax candles burned before painted saints. The priest began a familiar prayer, and the congregation answered. Outside, wind moved across roofs and rattled bare branches near the churchyard. Inside, voices rose beneath the arches. They were not loud enough to command the night, but they filled the silence with memory, trust, and human presence. For a little while, danger seemed farther away, held beyond oak doors, beyond candlelight, and beyond the final note lingering in the stone. When the congregation left the church, the village received them gently. The rain had passed, and the clouds were beginning to break above the fields. Water still shone in the ruts of the road. Drops fell from the churchyard yews, and the last candle smoke drifted through the open doorway before the priest lowered the wooden bar. The pilgrims crossed the market square toward their lodging. Villagers returned to cottages, workshops, and barns. A woman carried a covered bowl of pottage beneath her cloak. An old man led a reluctant goat by a short rope. Near the inn, a groom spread fresh straw in the stable while horses lowered their heads toward hay. Ordinary sound returned in small pieces. A shutter closed. A bucket touched the stone edge of the well. Someone laughed briefly behind a door, then lowered his voice as the hour grew late. These were not grand noises, yet they reassured those who heard them. They told the village that meals were being finished, animals secured, fires covered, and beds prepared. The final bell would soon cross the fields. For generations, bells had measured lives from baptism to burial. They called labourers from sleep, summoned worshippers beneath stone arches, warned of storms, announced deaths, and marked the hours when gates should close. Their voices outlasted the people who pulled the ropes. A bell ringer might know every mood of the metal. Cold changed its tone. Wind carried the sound toward one valley and away from another. A cracked bell could still serve for decades, becoming so familiar that villagers no longer noticed its imperfection. No one can quite agree whether medieval people heard bells with greater attention than later generations or merely depended upon them more. Yet a person working in a distant field often knew which bell was speaking, and why. The sound belonged to place as deeply as the river, the manor road, or the outline of the church tower. When the last bell rang that evening, its first stroke passed over the village roofs. It travelled toward the manor house, where the grain chest had been closed and the servants prepared to sleep near the fading hall fire. It crossed the byres, where cattle chewed slowly beneath dark beams. It reached the abbey, where monks moved toward the final office in disciplined silence. Farther away, the sound touched the forest edge. A charcoal burner tending his covered mound looked up from the red glow beneath the turf. A traveller settling beneath an oak drew his cloak more closely around himself. A shepherd counted the faint notes while sheep pressed together behind a woven hurdle. At the castle, the watch heard the same bell arrive, weakened by distance. Guards stood beneath fur-lined cloaks while the watchfire burned low. One called toward the gatehouse, and another answered from the western wall. The answering voices did not disturb the night. They completed it. Inside the castle hall, rushes lay across the floor, carrying the scent of dried herbs and smoke. A dog slept beneath a bench where scraps had fallen during supper. The great tables stood empty, and the soot-dark rafters disappeared above the last orange light of the hearth. The servants had learned which silences were harmless. A sleeping dog was harmless when its breathing remained steady. A quiet corridor was harmless when the expected guard had already passed. A closed chamber was harmless when the servant within had answered the evening call. Silence became frightening when it broke the pattern people trusted. That was why the stillness before a storm, an unanswered watch, a soundless buyer, or a villager without smoke could seem dangerous. Quiet removed the signs by which medieval people judged whether the world around them remained ordered. They lived without electric light, rapid messages, or distant authorities who could be summoned in moments. A household understood danger through what could be seen from a doorway and heard beyond a wall. The barking of dogs, the turning of mills, the ringing of bells, and the voices of neighbours formed a fragile web of knowledge. When the web fell silent, uncertainty entered. Sometimes the danger was real. Raiders moved without singing. Thieves lifted latches carefully. Illness stilled workshops and emptied lanes. Wolves waited beyond the fold. Fire began as a hidden ember before roofs crackled into flame. At other times, silence only seemed dangerous. A bird had stopped calling because it had flown to another branch. A watchman paused to remove mud from his shoe. A horse stared toward the fence because a cow had wandered loose. A candle failed because its wick had drowned in wax. The explanation arrived, and fear loosened. Yet medieval people also inhabited a world where uncertainty could remain unresolved. A traveller vanished on a road. A child became ill after sunset. A bell rang without a known hand upon the rope. Strange marks appeared near a threshold. Some chroniclers claimed that spirits crossed silent rooms. Others wrote that demons preferred solitude because fear grew more easily there. Villagers tied blessed branches over doors, carried saints' badges, whispered prayers, or kept a piece of iron beside the bed. Historians continue to debate what these practices meant to those who used them. A small iron object might have been a tool, a charm, or both. A prayer written on parchment might express devotion while also being worn for protection. Belief rarely obeyed the neat divisions later scholars tried to impose upon it. For the person lying beneath a wool blanket, such distinctions mattered less than reassurance. The door was barred, the embers were covered, a candle stub stood within reach. Someone familiar breathed nearby. Beyond the wall, a dog shifted in the yard. The medieval night remained dark, but not empty. Mist crossed the winter fields. Water moved beneath the wooden bridge near the abbey. Pilgrims slept close together in the guest house, their staffs resting against the wall and their damp badges catching a little firelight. In the monastery church, the brothers finished their final chant. Their voices lengthened beneath the stone vault, then faded one by one until only the last vibration remained. This silence was not feared. It had been prepared by prayer, bells, work, food, and the familiar steps of people returning to rest. It was a silence with boundaries, held inside known walls and watched by a community that would rise again when the morning bell sounded. Across the countryside, fires settled beneath ash. At the manor, the steward's account roll remained closed inside its chest. In the kitchen, blackened pots stood beside the hearth. In a cottage near the churchyard, a mother pulled a wool blanket over a sleeping child and listened until the breathing became deep and even. On a muddy road beyond the village, the final traveller reached the inn gate and called his name before knocking. The porter answered. The oak door opened, then closed behind him. Nothing more was required of the night. The watchfires could dim, the horses could rest. The pilgrims' roads, the monks' prayers, the market quarrels, and the secret fears behind manor walls could all wait for morning. The distant bell had finished speaking, but its memory remained over the fields. Generations would pass beneath that sound. Roofs would be repaired, castles abandoned, monasteries changed, and roads hardened beneath new wheels. The people who once listened for wolves, watchmen, spirits, and approaching riders would leave little behind except worn thresholds, broken pottery, scratched protective marks, and names written in fading ink. Still, their nights were not so different from ours. They listened for familiar sounds before allowing sleep to take them. They found comfort in another person nearby, in a guarded doorway, in rain upon a roof, and in the knowledge that the world had not gone entirely still. Now the village is sleeping. Moonlight rests upon stone walls. Mist lies low beside the road. The church tower rises quietly above the roofs, and beyond it the fields disappear into darkness. The last ember fades, the last footstep passes. The bells are silent now, but no danger waits within that silence. Only rest, memory, and the slow passing of time. Sweet dreams.